The courtroom was eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustle of pens on paper and the faint sound of a cough. Judge Randall Wilkins, a robust man with a sharp tongue and a penchant for belittling those who appeared before him, sat back in his chair. His eyes, cold and calculating, peered down over his glasses at the frail, elderly black woman standing alone in the center of the room. Her hands trembled just slightly, her silver-gray hair neatly styled into a bun. She wore a simple brown dress, with a modest pearl necklace resting at her throat. Judge Wilkins let out a small chuckle, his voice oozing with sarcasm. "Ma'am," he said, shaking his head in disbelief, "you're representing yourself? This is a courtroom, not some community meeting. Do you even realize where you are?" A few quiet snickers rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor, a young man wearing an expensive suit, smirked as if victory were already in his grasp. The elderly woman didn't flinch.
She didn't speak.
Instead, she locked eyes with the judge, her gaze unwavering, sharp, and intense. Judge Wilkins, undeterred, continued flipping through the papers in front of him. "Let me guess," he said with a mocking tone. "You've watched a few episodes of some courtroom drama, and now you think you're a lawyer?" He paused, waiting for a reaction. "Well, ma'am, I highly recommend you reconsider. This is serious business, and I don't have time for games." Then, something unexpected happened. The woman slowly, deliberately, reached into her purse and pulled out a dusty leather folder. She slid it across the table toward the baffled prosecutor. He hesitated, unsure of what he was looking at, but then picked it up. His face shifted from smug confidence to confusion as he flipped through the pages. His eyes widened, and in a hurried motion, he passed the folder to the judge. Judge Wilkins' face drained of color. The cocky smirk that had been plastered on his face was now gone, replaced with disbelief. His hands, once steady and in control, trembled slightly as he scanned the pages. His mouth opened, then closed, as if trying to find the words, but they wouldn't come. Gasps of astonishment rippled through the courtroom. A court clerk nearly dropped her coffee in shock. Even the prosecutor, once so sure of himself, stood there wide-eyed, his smug expression completely gone. The elderly woman tilted her head slightly, her voice cutting through the silence, sharp as a blade. "Now, Judge Wilkins," she said, her tone carrying the authority of decades of experience, "would you like to continue mocking me, or would you prefer to show some respect to a former Supreme Court attorney?" The courtroom fell silent. Every single person in the room was stunned into stillness, as if time itself had frozen. Hours earlier, as the first rays of the sun began to rise, Eleanor Jackson stepped out of her modest home. The handle of her worn leather briefcase was tightly gripped in her hand as she took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp morning air. Slowly, she began her walk toward the courthouse. Eleanor had spent decades in the courtroom, but today was different. Today, she was not walking in as an attorney defending a client, but as a defendant herself. She had never imagined this day would come. Just a month ago, she received a shocking notice. A wealthy real estate developer, Charles Duvall, was suing her, accusing her of fraud in a property dispute that had occurred nearly 30 years ago. The claim was absurd, accusing her of tampering with evidence, a lie that threatened to tarnish her entire career. She had spent her life fighting for justice, and now she was being accused of corruption. For weeks, Eleanor meticulously reviewed every document, every legal precedent she could find. She reached out to old colleagues for help, but none were willing to take her case. At her age, hiring a high-powered attorney was out of the question. So, she had only one choice. She would represent herself. As Eleanor entered the courthouse, she felt the weight of history bearing down on her. She had walked these halls countless times before, but today, everything felt different. People barely glanced at her as she passed, dismissing her as just another elderly woman, someone past their prime, who should be at home knitting rather than standing in a courtroom. She arrived early and quietly took her seat at the defendant's table. Across the room, Charles Duvall sat with his team of expensive lawyers, smirking. He whispered to one of them, clearly convinced that this case would be an easy win. When the judge finally entered, Eleanor took a steadying breath. She had faced far more ruthless opponents in her career, but this felt different. This wasn't just about winning a case. This was about protecting her legacy, her very name. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. Judge Wilkins shuffled his papers, barely looking in her direction as he called the case to order. And then, as expected, the mockery began. He eyed her up and down, raising an eyebrow. "I assume you're here to request a public defender, ma'am?" Eleanor simply folded her hands, her voice calm and unwavering. "No, Your Honor. I'll be representing myself." The courtroom chuckled. Judge Wilkins sighed dramatically. "Ma'am, do you even have any legal?" He didn't finish his sentence. Judge Wilkins stared at Eleanor, his expression filled with skepticism. "Experience?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Eleanor didn't respond immediately, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make the judge squirm in his impatience. Finally, she spoke. "A little." Judge Wilkins smirked, shaking his head. "This should be interesting," he muttered under his breath. Then, the prosecutor, a young man named Thomas Barrett, stood up, eager to make his case. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to make a motion to dismiss the defendant's ability to represent herself," he said, his voice filled with confidence. "Clearly, this woman is not qualified to handle a case of this magnitude." The judge nodded, his agreement almost immediate. "Frankly, I agree," he said, his eyes still on Eleanor. "Miss Jackson, this is your last chance. I highly recommend you seek professional legal representation." But that was the moment everything changed. Eleanor, with the same calm composure that had carried her through decades of legal battles, reached into her purse. The room held its breath as she slowly, deliberately, pulled out a set of credentials that would forever alter the course of the proceedings. As soon as the documents hit the table, gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Wilkins' face drained of color, and the courtroom fell into stunned silence. Eleanor had argued cases before the Supreme Court. She had won landmark cases that had shaped history. And now, in this courtroom, she was being mocked like a fool. The judge's smugness evaporated instantly. He cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Miss Jackson," he said, his tone suddenly polite and cautious, "I wasn't aware of your background. I apologize." Eleanor raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Save your apologies, Judge," she said coolly. "Let's get to the case." Judge Wilkins nodded quickly, now clearly on edge. He turned to Barrett, whose confident smirk had evaporated, replaced by a look of disbelief. "Proceed, Mr. Barrett," the judge said, his voice lacking its previous authority. Barrett swallowed hard and gathered his notes. He was clearly flustered. Eleanor could see it in his eyes. The confidence he had walked into the room with was gone. The real battle had just begun. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. Just moments ago, Eleanor had been treated like an afterthought, dismissed as an elderly woman who had wandered into the wrong place. But now, after her credentials were revealed, the room felt different. The judge, once dismissive, now sat upright, his posture rigid as he regarded Eleanor with a newfound caution. The prosecutor, Thomas Barrett, had lost the cocky smirk and was now flipping nervously through his notes, trying desperately to regain control. But Eleanor, as calm and composed as ever, simply waited. She had been in courtrooms like this one before, facing adversaries far more ruthless than Barrett. But today, this case wasn't just another case. This was personal. Barrett cleared his throat again. "Your Honor, while the defense may have a legal background, that does not change the fact that she is accused of serious misconduct," he said, attempting to regain his footing. Eleanor did not flinch. She had anticipated this move, a desperate attempt to claw back some semblance of control. Barrett continued, "The plaintiff, Mr. Charles Duval, has brought forward evidence suggesting that Miss Jackson tampered with official property records in a case from 30 years ago. This, we believe, constitutes fraud, and we seek full restitution." Judge Wilkins nodded, his expression unreadable. "Miss Jackson," he asked, "do you wish to respond before we proceed?" Eleanor slowly rose to her feet. She was elderly, yes, but her presence commanded attention. The year she had spent in the courtroom had shaped her into a formidable force. She stood tall, unwavering. "I do, Your Honor," she said, her voice calm yet resolute. She turned to face Barrett directly. "Mr. Barrett," she began, her gaze locking with his, "you claim that I tampered with property records. Tell me, have you seen these alleged falsified documents yourself?" Barrett hesitated for just a moment. His eyes flicked to the stack of papers in front of him, but Eleanor's voice cut through the air, steady and unyielding. "That wasn't my question," she said, her tone sharp. "I asked if you have seen them." Barrett exhaled sharply, clearly flustered. "No, but my client." "Your client," Eleanor repeated, cutting him off. Yes, Charles Duval, the man who has built an entire empire on stealing land from the poor and calling it urban development." Duval, who had been sitting quietly until now, shot up from a seat, his face red with anger. "That's outrageous," he shouted. "Your Honor, I object to this baseless attack on my character." Eleanor turned to the judge, her expression cool. "Your Honor, I'm merely pointing out the well-documented history of Mr. Duval's real estate empire," she said smoothly. "Shall I submit articles and court records detailing his previous lawsuits for fraud, land misappropriation, and illegal evictions?" A murmur ran through the courtroom. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Judge Wilkins, trying to regain control, cleared his throat. "Miss Jackson, please keep your statements relevant to this case." Eleanor nodded without hesitation. "Of course, Your Honor," she said, her voice never wavering. "Let's talk about this case, then." She walked over to the evidence table, her movements deliberate. "May I see the document that allegedly proves my wrongdoing?" she asked, her voice steady. Barrett hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. After a long moment, he nodded to his assistant, who handed over a yellowed piece of paper. Eleanor took it carefully, adjusting her glasses as she examined it with a critical eye. Then she smiled. It was the kind of smile that made the opposing side nervous, the kind of smile that meant someone had made a colossal mistake. She turned back to Barrett, holding up the document. "Mr. Barrett," she said, her voice dripping with pointed calm, "do you know what forensic document analysis is?" Barrett frowned. "Of course," he replied, trying to regain his composure. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Good," she said, holding the document up for all to see. "Because anyone with half a brain can see that this paper was not written 30 years ago.